everyone, this is Fariba, one of the co-hosts of the Movieception Show, and today we're going to dive into the rabbit hole of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. And literally, this is the MCU movie that everyone is super excited about it. It is being compared to Infinity War, Endgame, and No Way Home in cinematic experience combined. And again, the title itself literally says Multiverse of Madness, so we know that shit is really going to get down. But not just that, but the movie itself is going to feature two of the most powerful MCU characters, so what could really go wrong, right? And of course, one of those two characters is Wanda Maximoff, and nowadays she is considered one of the best MCU characters that we've been introduced since the inception. But back when this project had started, not a lot of people knew who Wanda Maximoff was, or at least didn't know her true potential. Well, not until WandaVision came out, and that's when we really started to see the peak of who Wanda Maximoff is. And not just Wanda Maximoff, but the Scarlet Witch. And then not too long after, we got our first ever teaser of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which actually was attached as a post-credit scene for No Way Home. And of course, everyone's minds were blown away by this trailer, especially because of the unexpected revelation of Dark Doctor Strange. And of course, that was just only the beginning. Then the Super Bowl trailer had dropped a couple months later, and then we started to really delve into some of the big stuff about this movie, including potential surprise character appearances. And just by watching the teaser and the official trailer, that alone explains why it is one of my most anticipated movies of the year. There's just so much at high stakes. I mean, I am super excited with what really unleashes in this movie and what they do with the Doctor Strange and Wanda character, and how they try to how it literally affects the MCU and the grand scope of it in general. And not just that, but who could actually be coming into the MCU in general. And now the wait is almost over. We are now just about 4 days away from its official release of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Well, at least in my case, it's gonna be 3 days because I am seeing it on Thursday night. And even though we do have to wait a couple more days until the movie drops, we do know that the level of security for this movie is just about the same level as Endgame back in 2019, which itself explains the amount of significance this movie is going to have, and what the extent that they're going through to make sure that no leaks or spoils come out into the public, although I don't know if that really has worked out too well. But even then, the critics and the press junket have yet to see the entirety of this movie. Not until tonight, where they're actually going to have the premiere for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, and tonight will be the first ever full screening for the movie. And here is a Twitter post by Eric Davis that basically sums up the level of security for this movie. Disney will be giving Doctor Strange the Star Wars and Endgame treatment. No one sees the full film until May 2nd. Reactions will follow premiere, reviews to drop the next morning. This is due to spoilers and keeping the surprises hidden till as close to release as possible. That is why today in this video we're going to be talking about some of the theories and predictions for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, and some of the characters who I think will possibly potentially show up in this movie. So the first on this list is Captain Britain, and of course a lot of us are familiar with the character back in What If. So instead of Steve Rogers undergoing the Super Soldier Project, it is actually Peggy Carter who becomes the Super Soldier, and so instead of Captain America we get Captain Britain. And now the chances of her in this film is essentially a done deal. I think we can, if I have to really give a percentage, it's like a 98%, and that's just being way too low. Let's be honest, since the beginning of this marketing for the film, we've seen hints that Captain Britain's going to be in this movie, from the shredded glass that shows the appearance of her shield, to the point that we literally just got a TV spot where we literally see Captain Britain fighting off, I believe to be Wanda Maximoff. And I would have to presume that it's Haley Atwell who's playing Captain Britain, because she has been playing Peggy Carter since the Captain America: The First Avenger, and she even came back in Endgame to reprise that role. So I would assume that she will be coming back to play the character once again, and I think that's just a given. So at this point, we can literally say that Captain Britain is basically a done deal that she is going to be in this movie, that I think she's probably the most confident character we can all say for sure will be in this movie, that we predict will be in this movie. I think the next likeliest character to be in this movie, in my opinion, who I actually ranked really high, has to be Reed Richards, aka Mr. Fantastic. And not just any version of Reed Richards slash Mr. Fantastic, but I even marked that the actor to play the character will be John Krasinski. And honestly, this is kind of a very delicate position right now for Marvel Studios, because it's not like we haven't seen Mr. Fantastic in the big screen before. I mean, if anything, this is the third time that the fans are going to be watching Mr. Fantastic on the big screen. There has been two other versions of it which haven't been the best of the best. I mean, the first version has been mediocre at best, although people still like it. But of course, then we have the 2014 Josh Tank version that was the most abysmal thing ever. Now, the good news is that Marvel Studios have acquired the rights back to the Fantastic Four characters. And not just that, but Kevin Feige announced at the San Diego Comic Con in 2019 that they are making a Fantastic Four movie. Which, I mean, at this point, they couldn't make it any more worse than it already has been, right? However, there has been some shocking new developments that the director of the Spider-Man Homecoming trilogy, John Watts, has exited from the Fantastic Four movie. And while I don't want to delve too much in the rabbit hole as to why John Watts had left the project, but one thing's for certain is that they're going to try and make this movie regardless of who the director is. But of course, the one thing that everyone is focused on is who will be casted as the Fantastic Four. Now, one of the favorite fan casts for one of the members of the Fantastic Four team is Reed Richards, and a lot of people are hoping that it is John Krasinski who gets to play this stretchy superhero. And let's be honest here, just to see him just show up on the big screen as Reed Richards would be just super exciting, and it'll be a perfect way to really bring in the Fantastic Four characters. Now, would that mean that this is the official casting for Fantastic Four? I have no idea. I mean, anything could happen at this point. But also, let's be honest here, that this is not the first time that Marvel has actually introduced a character earlier before the actual movie. I mean, let's look at T'Challa, let's look at Black Widow, for instance, right? They didn't even have their movie until like much later. So in the case of even Black Panther, he showed up in Civil War in 2016, yet his actual movie didn't come out until 2018. And let's not end our predictions right there. I think at this point we can all kind of agree that if there are any chance of Mr. Fantastic showing up in this movie, it's very likely that he's one of the members of the Illuminati. As to how that really happens, I can't say for sure, but I think that that's probably going to be the more exciting things that could be happening in this movie. Probably just to bring a huge war of people when if this were to ever happen. But I do believe that Reed Richards ranks as one of the higher potential of characters who may show up in this movie. I think I would even give it an 85% just because it just seems so likely, and his contributions to how he features in this movie would bode very well for why he appears, especially as a member of the Illuminati. So the next character that I think that could actually potentially show up in this movie is, well, it kind of goes a little bit into some of the things that we have seen in this trailer, and that is sort of the X-Men, but we won't just go into the X-Men in general, but we're going to dive into more of the specifics of which X-Men character will actually show up in this movie. Now, at this point, we can all basically confirm that Professor X is in this movie, which means that there's a really high potential that the X-Men will be featuring in this movie. As to who will show up, we don't know. But the thing is, Professor X is in this movie, and it's going to be Patrick Stewart's version, which is really exciting and has us wondering who else could show up. And I think one of the higher potentials to show up is Magneto. Now, as to how much of a significance, I won't say necessarily as part of a big part of the story itself, but I think it might build up to something that is in a sense of a post-credit scene, or something that just ends off in a cliffhanger that shows that, hey, we have Magneto showing up in this movie to really make shit happen, and not just that, but create more shit to happen in future movies. Now, of course, the X-Men series is a bit of a delicate thing going on because we don't just have the original trilogy, but we also have the first class version where we see a much younger version of Professor X and Magneto, and just basically their origin stories of who they are and why they became this, and their friendship and why their friendship kind of devolved from all of this. Now, I won't really dive into kind of the summary of what happened in the X Men movies. I mean, that's something that you all should be watching right now to understand the gist of what the X Men are and what the story has been and where it has gone so far and all sorts of things. But for one thing, I will say is that bringing in the X Men into this movie, considering who the characters are showing that are going to appear in this movie, kind of makes things really, really interesting. So many of you are wondering, if that is the case, why haven't the MCU mentioned the mutants before? Well, that has to kind of do with a bit more of a complication in terms of the studios behind the scenes, because of the fact that the X-Men were still under Fox Studios back when Age of Ultron had came out, and there was still that whole iffiness of, well, who gets what, because Wanda Maximoff is an Avenger, but she's also a mutant. They kind of had to do some sort of this deal or whatnot, and eventually they settled something where both companies were able to share the characters in the same year. Let's talk about Days of Future Past and Age of Ultron. But now that's behind our backs. I mean, since then, Disney managed to buy out Fox Studios, acquire every character, including the X-Men series, and now we have this. So now, at this point, there is a really high chance that they might retcon everything about the mutants back in 2015. Be like, oh, no, 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 she is a mutant. It's still possible. And with that being said, I think that is entirely possible now that we know for a fact that Professor X is going to be in this movie, which implies that this X Men are very likely going to be in this movie as well. And I think the one character who will show up is Magneto in this very, very chilling way. I believe I may have heard this in the John Campion show, but one of the theories is that the post-credit scene or in some sort of cliffhanger, we're going to see Magneto come from afar and meet up with his daughter and have her join his group as, and I believe if we were to get an ending like that, holy crap, it would just literally change the trajectory of the MCU from there on. I mean, at that point it's just fair game of what could and could not happen. Just to bring in the X-Men into the MCU just means that shit is really going to get real. I mean, the fact is that Wanda Maxwell might even have a bigger role than we have anticipated. It might even lead into the House of M storyline, which is probably one of the most fantastic comic book series out there, and it just makes you just clenching your just getting all these goosebumps thinking that, oh my god, this could be the setup of what the MCU could happen. Now, as we've mentioned before, that there's a little bit of this iffiness that's going on with this whole movie, right? Like, in terms of the X-Men series, we've seen both the younger and older versions of the characters and all that sort of stuff, right? So now the question is, which version of Magneto would we see? Will we see the Ian McKellen version? Will we see Michael Fassbender version? I mean, the more realistic choice would probably be Ian McKellen, because if we're going to have Patrick Stewart, then the smart choice would be to bring in McKellen. But there's also a part of me that just wants to see the Fassbender version, just because, at least in the first class era, there was something that was done in terms of his character development, his character arc, that we didn't really get to see in the Ian McKellen version. Where in the Ian McKellen version, we kind of saw that not necessarily the absolute bad guy, but he's just a bit of a radical who believes that the mutants are far more superior, right? But we haven't really delved into kind of his reasoning behind that, his emotionality behind his whole ideology, his whole philosophy about mutants versus humans. Whereas, at least in the first class version, the Michael Fassbender version, we kind of see a bit more of that origin story, the backstory of why he thinks the way he does, the why he has such emotions about mutants and humans and all sorts of things, and why he has this ideology about humans and mutants, and why he thinks that mutants are far superior than humans. And one of the things that you really have to compliment Michael Fassbender for is that he added this depth into Magneto. That he isn't just, again, an absolute antagonist who always has this dark persona about everything, that he is wicked and evil or anything like that. In a way, we saw this complexity about this character, things that made him very sympathetic. I mean, he is a Holocaust survivor. He saw his own mother get murdered by Shaw, and then not just that, but things just really gone to shit even after that. And it does just end there, right? We've seen even more tragedy in his own life later on in his life, where he lost his daughter in Apocalypse, and that really set the tone up for his more darker, his more emotional side of everything. I think that that is something that would really work well into Multiverse of Madness if we were to get his version of Magneto instead of Ian McKellen's version. And again, I think that just goes into the whole emotional aspect, right? Like, Wanda herself is very, very sad. She's emotional. She has one of the most tragic storylines in the MCU. I mean, the only other character who actually emulates just that level of tragedy is Thor himself. But we've seen even in WandaVision how this grief, this loss that she's been through, the worst part of it is that she has been alone this whole time. And for her to have Magneto come in and be like, hey, daughter, I'm here to recruit you. Join us and the mutants, and we'll just do shit. And that would just, I mean, that probably isn't the way that's going to be planned out, but in a much better way. I mean, just to see a version of that would just be mind blowing, because it just would fit really well into the story, knowing that, well, we have this really sad Wanda, and we also have an equally tragic Magneto, who both will mesh well, and also just bring in some of the more comic adaptation, more the comic accuracy that, well, let's be honest, Wanda Maximoff is the daughter of Magneto, and it just bodes so well. It'll just, I mean, it'll probably be the most exciting thing ever, this most cinematic thing ever, and that's something that I cannot wait to see if that were to be the case. I mean, that's just my own theory and prediction of it. But with that even being said, I think that Magneto's a very high possibility. I mean, you can't have a Professor X without a Magneto, or, well, technically speaking, Logan already did that, but let's hope that if we're going to have Professor X, we're going to also have a Magneto in this movie as well. I would prefer a Fassbender, although the more realistic choice will be the McKellen version. And I'm going to digress a little bit from the X-Men characters, because I think there is one other character who is very significant to this movie that we've actually seen a little snippets of in the trailers and teasers and all that sort of stuff, and that is Captain Marvel. But not the Carol Danvers version, but the Maria Rambeau version. I believe we're going to see Maria Rambeau as Captain Marvel in this movie, and I believe that the trailers have kind of confirmed that in some sense. Let's be honest, we have seen a glaring figure of somebody flying up, just happens to look like Captain Marvel, but we know for a fact that it is not the Carol Danvers version. I think that the more perfect reason why it's probably going to be Maria Rambeau, because, well, let's be honest, Wanda kind of has a history with the Rambeaus. Well, more so with Monica than Maria. But I think Maria will be the Captain Marvel, will be the essence of Captain Marvel, or the variant of Captain Marvel in this movie, just because she does have a history with Carol Danvers. I mean, her timeline fits well with Carol Danvers, and it's quite possible that instead of Carol Danvers, who ended up becoming this Kree who had this accident, it's going to be Maria Rambeau who has this accident and ends up becoming not a Kree, but working with the Kree and basically becoming Captain Marvel. And I won't dive too deep into this, just because we have seen the sneak peeks and we have seen the trailers to a point where we can basically be confident that we are seeing Captain Marvel. It is just the variant version of Captain Marvel that's being debated. It could be Maria, it could be Monica. I think it'd be more so Maria, and I think a lot of it might just have to do with the fact that she kind of did have cancer. I believe she had cancer in WandaVision. I might have to go back, but she was sick. I think that might kind of be the connection to everything, and I think that that might be the reason why I think the version that we are seeing is Maria, not Monica. So now, kind of going back into the X-Men characters of who I think could show up in this movie, I think probably the most obvious one that a lot of people are wondering about is a Quicksilver, who happens to be the twin brother of Wanda Maximoff. Now, as I mentioned before, there was a bit of that iffiness between Marvel Studios and Fox Studios, just because there was that contract and the rights and all that sort of stuff. I'm not going to go too much into it, but essentially back in those days they had to agree upon something. And so yes, we did see two different versions of Quicksilver, one for Marvel, one for Fox. And in the Marvel version they instantly killed him off in the first movie, in his first movie, while whereas Quicksilver in the Fox movies stayed as a very pretty significant character. Now, in terms of this movie, I do think that there is a pretty high possibility that Quicksilver will show up in this movie. And just to take it even further up, I think both versions of Quicksilver will show up in this movie. And that's just because, well, one for one part, I mean, let's go back to WandaVision a little bit, right? We remember that I believe it was the fourth episode where we saw not just any version of Quicksilver, but it is the Evan Peters version, or the Evan Peters version, that shows up at Wanda's door and saying and basically pretending to be Wanda's twin brother, even though we all know that in this universe this isn't the appearance or the physique of the Quicksilver that we know in this universe. But even with that being said, they kind of did not go too, they didn't dive too much into it. I mean, instead, they kind of made this joke that, well, he's actually Ralph Boner, not necessarily Quicksilver, which is kind of like, well, not the greatest revelation, but at least it kind of fixes things up with regards to the whole brother thing. And I also know that there's kind of this kind of mystery behind whether or not even Aaron Taylor Johnson even has this interest of returning as Quicksilver, because he has been recently casted as Kraven the Hunter in the Sony Spider universe. And well, it's kind of like, well, yeah, but that shouldn't stop him from playing Quicksilver as well. I think just because anything could happen in this movie, I think there is a very high chance that Aaron Taylor Johnson, for some reason, somehow agreed to return as the Quicksilver, to maybe to perhaps just give him a proper conclusion, not just that death that he had in Age of Ultron, just to give him a bit more depth, just to give a bit more of that brother sisterly bonding between them, between him and Wanda. And that's something that would be pretty cool. But also, it'll also be a very confusing but also very curious way of trying to integrate the Evan Peters version somehow, some way that we now have two Quicksilvers in this movie that will just make things even more berserk, but also shows the capacity of what this multiverse is and how much of its instability is. In the end, there is a high chance at least one of them will show up, but I think just to make things go even crazier, I think having both of them show up will really take it up a notch. But to kind of go more into the more realistics of it, I think that in terms of Aaron Taylor Johnson showing up, I'll probably give it like a 30%, just because there is that gray area of him being as Kraven, and it's really quite possible that he's done with with the MCU. Although, again, there's just a lot of iffiness about this. As for Evan Peters, I think there's a much higher chance that he'll show up in this movie. I'll probably say a 55%, just because he is in WandaVision. He has appeared in WandaVision. He has a character in WandaVision. It's very likely that he will somehow come back, or he might have a contribution to the story. He might have something going on. I think for that reason, the Evans version might have a higher chance than the Johnson version. The next character that I want to talk about, that who has a very high potential of showing up, is also the one character that everyone cannot stop talking about, because he has been referenced so many times in the MCU, and not just in the trailers but also in previous movies, and that is Neymar. Now, personally speaking, I don't know this character too well in terms of the comic books. I just know that he's kind of the MCU version of Aquaman. But with that being said, I believe that he has a very high chance of showing up in this movie because of some of the references of him in previous movies. Like, for instance, the fact that at one point Okoye mentioned about a seismic earthquake that happened in the middle of the Atlantic. I mean, that's gotta be Namor, right? But the question is, how will he be introduced? How would he be significant into the MCU, especially in Phase 4, knowing that kind of most of the Infinity War saga has ended? And now I think the best bet I've heard, the best prediction theory that I've heard so far, is that he's very likely a member of the Illuminati. I think that we still haven't really deciphered who the members are yet, aside from Professor X, I believe Kara Mordor, And I think that's just about it. I think there may have been maybe one or two other characters, but all we've seen is just visual, just the physiques of who they are, what they may look like, and I think that Namor seems to be a very high likelihood of showing up in this movie. I believe from a lot of the fan theories and all that, and I myself am very convinced by the fact that Namor could be in this movie as well, and maybe just begin his journey into the MCU as well. I would probably give it a 55% for that, and very likely because he is a member of the Illuminati. Now, with the remaining characters that we're going to discuss about, I think there are just a bit more of a gray areas between them. They're probably ones who I would say I have less confidence in, not necessarily 50%, but less than the 50%. One character I know that everyone's talking about and really hopes could happen is the Wolverine, of course, the Hugh Jackman Wolverine. And again, there's a little bit of a gray area into this because, technically speaking, Hugh Jackman retired his role as the Wolverine. I mean, this is a guy who played the character for 17 years, and even though he doesn't really fit the comic accuracy of who Logan is, that doesn't really matter. The thing is that Hugh Jackman really did such a phenomenal job playing the Wolverine in the X-Men series, and oh my god, I mean, just to have him come back and just play him again in the MC would be great. I mean, would that, the possibilities of it, I can't say. I mean, again, it's totally up to Hugh Jackman whether or not he wants to come back as a Wolverine. If so, that may just change everything. Although it's very likely it just might be one and done. But with that being said, I think what really sets up the fact that, or what may be the catalyst that will allow him to show up in the MCU might just be because of Days of Future Past. Because this is a movie that goes more into the, because let's be honest, Multiverse of Madness goes into the time space continuum in a sense, because we are going into dimensions. It involves time, it involves space, it involves reality, right? And what X-Men character hasn't gone and done time traveling than the Wolverine? And I think that Days of Future Past will be a very important setup into that. That might just be the trigger for it. As to how, as to whether or not it will be significant, it's kind of unclear. But the chances of the Wolverine showing up in the movie seems like a possibility, although it's not very high. It's not something you can say it's very, you'd be very confident about. But I think that in terms of Wolverine, there's a bit of that 50-50 chance of it. And then so for that reason, I would stick for him as a 50-50. And the next candidate I want to go into is Deadpool, just because he is pretty significant to the X-Men franchise. I mean, he literally has this really close relationship to the Wolverine of all characters, right? And I think that one of the things that when we talk about Deadpool is that he is a bit more of a comedic character. I mean, that's just the way that Ryan Reynolds had set him up. Of course, the way that he was introduced into the X-Men franchise wasn't the greatest. I mean, we all want to forget that whatever that abysmal looking thing was in the Wolverine, what was it called? Wolverine Origins. You don't want to remember that sort of shit. But regardless, we have seen a bit more of a redeeming story for the Deadpool. I mean, ever since Ryan Reynolds portrayed him back in 2016 in his own cinema movie, we've really grown to love Deadpool, this rated R version who really is bloody, gory, basically everything that makes Deadpool great. But now, the likelihood of him being in this movie, right? I mean, this is supposed to be a horror-esque multiverse of madness film, right? I mean, goriness and violence kind of seems suitable. But the problem is that I believe kind of reduces his chances that Deadpool's kind of more of a comedic character, whereas Multiverse of Madness really has a horror-esque, stern tone where everything's very serious. I think that bringing anything comedic undertones into this movie would just ruin the tone, ruin the mood, the attitude of the film, and that's something that you really do not want to do. And I think that even for a director like Sam Raimi, this is not something that he would want to risk. And so I think that with the chance of Deadpool being in this movie is like more of a 30%. I think if there were to be a chance for him to show up, it'd probably be like a post-credit scene, which seems like the most fitting thing for him. But for him to show up and just be like, hey, I'm Deadpool, and just doing stupid stuff just for the sake of doing comedy, it's just, not the greatest pacing for the film, and that's not something that you really want to do. And I think that just for that reason, I mean, Deadpool will be great, but I think that there might be better ways to bring Deadpool into the end. And we're going to speed run through a lot of some of these characters that a lot of people are kind of iffy or just wondering or curious that could show up in this movie. I think another big one has been a Tom Cruise Iron Man, and that's just because there has been reports that Tom Cruise was considered as one, I think, shortlisted to play the Tony Stark before Robert Downey Jr. was officially casted as Iron Man, and perfectly has, and it's just a perfect embodiment of Tony Stark slash Iron Man. Although the chances are possible that Tom Cruise could be playing a version of Iron Man, because I mean, again, we are talking about variants, we're talking about multiverse, right? We could be different iterations of Iron Man that could show up for all we know. And I think that there is a possibility that Tom Cruise could somehow show up. I mean, as to how, again, it could be more so fitting towards the Illuminati stuff, and that's just it. I'm gonna give it more so of a 30% that he will show up. I mean, it might even be possible that it's kind of confirmed, but again, I just feel like it just seems a bit sudden to bring in Tom Cruise to play Iron Man, especially given that we've had Robert Downey Jr. and I don't know. I I think it's just kind of a personal thing that I just don't want to see Tom Cruise play a version of Iron Man. I think another character worth bringing up is Loki, just because he recently did have a TV show that basically that literally focuses on the multiverse, the conceptual of of it all. And I mean, essentially Loki is very important just to get a general gist of what the multiverse is and what it is like behind the scenes, at least, because what we're seeing is kind of just the forefront, but Loki, the series itself, kind of goes into the behind the scenes of what the multiverse is, how does it uncover, how it operates, and all that sort of stuff. Now, in terms of the character Loki himself, I'm gonna give it a 20% chance of him showing up. I just think that given how much is at stake, how much star power that we're already getting from Doctor Strange and Wanda Maximoff, I just think that bringing in a third character like Loki might just take away a lot of their spotlight. It might even just make it a bit more congested in terms of just the main characters that we do have. Yeah, I mean, he has just about the same magical, sorcery abilities as Wanda and Doctor Strange, and it'll just be a great trio just to have that many sorcerers, wizards, magical beings, or whatnot just to show up in this movie. But with that being said, I just think that Loki just might not be the most appropriate character to show up here. I think he, again, is more reserved kind of in the backstage of what's going on. And again, like, I doubt that he really has that much of a relationship with Wanda per se, although he has kind of met with Doctor Strange a little bit, I believe, in Thor Ragnarok. And yeah, there is a bit of a relationship. I just think that just because there's so much already going on, I think that bringing in Loki, who I think with Loki, I think he is reserved for other opportunities, or he has other purposes to serve than just to just show up in this movie, be like, hey, I'm a variant, and just showing up just to for the sake of the multiverse. When I think that he'd be more, and not just that, but also he is getting a second season, and for that I think that there needs to be more development into Loki himself and all that sort of stuff. And that's just kind of the reason why I think that Loki has a much lower chance of showing up in this movie. I mean, would it be great to see him? It would be great, but again, I think that there's already so much going on that I would just rather that the spotlight just be with Wanda and Doctor Strange, rather than just bringing another big character in the MCU just show up for the sake of the multiverse. I think that he might have a much better purpose in the whole multiverse story than just in this forefront of it. And just again, just to speed things up a little bit, I know there's a lot of discussion about whether either iterations of Tobey Maguire or Andrew Garfield's version of Spider-Man will show up in this movie, just because, I mean, Doctor Strange and Multiverse of Madness is literally a direct aftermath of No Way Home. I mean, why couldn't Spider-Man show up in this movie for all we know? I mean, to be honest, I think that given what has happened in No Way Home, I think it's best to not go back into the whole situation with Spider-Man. I think that what has happened with Spider-Man has happened with Spider-Man. I mean, he could be referenced, he could be mentioned for all I care. it would work that way. But I think that bringing in either iterations of Toby or Andrew, I think just takes away kind of the overall message of what's going on in the multiverse. I mean, would it be great to see them? It totally would be great to see them again. I just feel like it's kind of just, it might just feel a bit more random to be bringing them into this sort of movie where we're trying to introduce other things and then just bring in something outside from Sony. It's just kind of, it just takes away the focus of it all. I think that if there is to be a percentage of it, I think Garfield's version might have a higher chance of showing up, and I think that's just because Garfield himself is a bit more passionate about this character. I mean, we've seen how much he's loved this character, even though he received so much backlash from the Amazing Spider-Man series. But nowadays, people are loving his character. I mean, you can sense the amount of passion he had just reprising his version of Peter Parker in No Way Home. And I think that if there were to be a chance for either one to show up, it would probably be the Andrew Garfield version, because I think he would be more so inclined to showing up just for the fact that he loves the character alone. And that's basically all the character predictions I have. I mean, I'm super stoked to see Multiverse of Madness. I'm super excited to see who does show up. I mean, I'll probably be losing my mind when I actually get to see this movie on Thursday. So I'll be super pumped. I mean, let me know, what do you think? Do you agree with some of the characters that might show up in this movie? Do you think I over or underestimated my count? Who else do you think I may have missed? Let us know right in the comics, and if you like the content that we have here, subscribe below and make sure to click the notification. Thanks.